last year at this time, well, here's what I was saying, Sam. A year from now, they'll look dangerous. So here we are, a year from now. And what I would say is they accelerated that timeline. Right in the middle of last year, Jordan Love starts looking like a star. Those young wide receivers start to get on the same page as Jordan Love, and before you know it, they have an explosive offense, and they're the youngest team in the NFL, and they have all the pieces to get up there and challenge the Detroit Lions.
Yeah, I mean, the Green Bay Packers, I think, are one of the most interesting teams in the NFL because for the second year in a row, they have the youngest roster in football. They have Jordan Love, who is fresh off the back of a second half of the season where he looked like the best quarterback in the NFL, got paid accordingly, top of the market money, but it's still a crazy small sample size of elite play for him. So we don't really know if that's who he's going to be going forward. But it means that, like, Green Bay have almost created this sort of video game roster where they've just gone for youth and young guys and, potential everywhere and very little in the way of sort of older, established players. And we don't and everyone's excited by that because youth equals potential, right? So the youngest roster in the NFL equals the most potential in the NFL. But it might not necessarily be the case. Except that they've already shown themselves to have quite a high level of potential by making the playoffs, by, almost sort of knocking over an elite team in the postseason. So on the one hand, it's very easy to talk yourself into this idea that, well, if all those young guys take a step forward this offseason together and Jordan Love continues to play like the best quarterback in the NFL, then this is an elite championship caliber team. It's also sort of easy to say, well, that's not the way that always works, right? All these young guys don't necessarily take this nice, neat, linear step forward together. Some guys are going to get better. Some guys are going to get worse. Some guys are simply not going to work out. And actually, it's finding that balance that's going to determine where they actually end up this year.
It's part of the reason why you're saying I think they're such a fascinating story is, has any team done as well as the Packers at simply developing players? I mean, the Jordan Love story as a whole, drafting him in the first round, sitting him for 3 years, putting him out there as the starter, giving him this, hybrid contract. Hey, go prove it, but we'll give you a little bit of money. Takes him some time, and then before you know it, boom, looks unbelievable. In addition to Dontavian Wicks is a 5th-round pick. We drafted all these other receivers, but Dontavian Wicks could be the best receiver. Romeo Doubs could be the best receiver. Christian Watson, Jaden Reed. They have 4 receivers all competing. Like, who's the actual top target here? They have 2 tight ends that they drafted last year in Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave. They have drafted in volume. They always love to double up at position groups. And in the past, it'd be like, yeah, this guy hit and this guy didn't. But it feels like they're doubling up and hitting on a lot of these position groups. So it's the depth on this team, in addition to the youth, and even hitting on a guy like Rasheed Walker as a late-round pick to maybe be their left tackle of the future, a guy who was not very productive in his college career. They've just done a lot of good things these last couple of years, reshaping this roster after Aaron Rodgers' departure here, and I think that's part of where all the excitement's coming from, because they looked like a completely different team down the stretch last year, and gave it their all against a really good Niners team in the playoffs and just fell a little short.
And they're also ticking the boxes in terms of plausible, but probably not real offseason story that's going to fix one of their problem players. Christian Watson hasn't been able to stay healthy, hasn't been able to be the explosive playmaker he was supposed to be. Well, they found out his legs were, not the same size, and one of them had way more muscle mass than the other, and now we fixed his hamstring issues because he's balanced now. So, it's very easy to talk yourself into the total optimistic outcome for the Green Bay Packers. And the total optimistic outcome is genuinely special. It's one of the best teams in the league.
Defense had some issues last year. They bring in Jeff Hafley from Boston College. One of those rare, we're going to go from head coach at the FBS level to coordinator at the NFL level. But Hafley's going to bring in a new scheme, play a little bit more single high. The Packers don't necessarily, the Packers don't necessarily dabble in free agency a ton, much like the Steelers historically. It's just, draft and develop your own. But when the Packers go to free agency, you get a guy like Xavier McKinney who fits the scheme perfectly, will play that free safety role, in Halfley's scheme. That's the other part to be optimistic about. If the defense is just a little bit better and not blowing those late game leads, and not like they were just so inconsistent, I think, in the past game and in their run fits week to week. It was like they're giving up explosive plays on the ground. The next week they're looking pretty good. Very inconsistent on the defensive side of the ball. And again, when you get a new scheme in there on the defensive side of the ball, sometimes it does actually work wonders with similar talent. And I think the Packers have a chance to just look much better on that side of the ball.
Yeah, I mean, particularly like if you're sometimes when your previous scheme is so consistently underachieving, then simply change for the sake of change is a positive thing, right? Just get rid of what you identify as the problem, and it almost doesn't matter what you're replacing it with. So this is nothing against, Halfley, but the idea is simply removing the last coach might be the biggest improvement here. And then if Halfley's bringing a really good scheme to the table, or if he's a really good coach in his own right and can move this thing forward, then yeah, this defense could take a huge step forward, which again, just another reason to be extremely optimistic for the Packers.
Pass rush looks solid with Rashawn Gary, Preston Smith. You have Lucas Van Ness. Last year's first round pick was okay. I think he's a better edge setting run defender in his first year. I think he still has the ability to do that on early downs and maybe change of pace pass rusher as a third rusher with Gary and Preston Smith. So again, I think they have pieces to at least be reasonable on the defensive side of the ball, but this team, let's paint best and worst case scenarios. Best case scenario, second half was real last year. That receiving core is real. And I would also say the Christian Watson thing, he was an explosive playmaker. He was a big play threat in 2022, both in the red zone where they would isolate him and get him running away from defenders in man coverage. He was getting behind the defense. Add a healthy Watson to what we saw last year with Dontavian Wicks and Jaden Reed as rookies and Romeo Doubs as the veteran of the group, and a solid offensive line, a reasonable defense. I mean, best case scenario is the Packers can win the North and make a run to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, it really is. Like the best case scenario is the optimistic viewpoint of all of the youth and all of the things we're talking about is real. And actually this team is legit as a Super Bowl contender. I mean, that's ultimately the bottom line. If Jordan Love is as good as he looked for the second half of the season, if that young group does all take a step forward together, if the offensive line stays solid, if the defense takes a step forward, I mean, we've painted a picture of a team that is genuinely a contender and are up there with San Francisco, Detroit, Philadelphia, whoever else you want to throw in there from the NFC. There's no reason this can't be a Super Bowl team if that is a realistic outcome for them.
Worst case scenario, and I know you're not afraid to, go out on a limb and say the opposite every now and again, but you might be the most vocal person who's bringing up the small sample size with Jordan Love. Like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I know it's a good story. Sat for 3 years. Started slow, turned it on. All right, rest is history. He's a star. But the reality is we're talking like 8 to 10 games here of excellent play from Jordan Love. But the reality is it's still just 8 to 10 games.
Yeah, like I'm very torn on this because I believe what we saw from Jordan Love. Like he looked really, really good in the second half of the season. And if I had to, bet money on is he going to be legit or not right now, I would make the bet that he is, just like the Packers did when they gave him, one of the top of the market money deals that's ever been signed. They have believed. They've said Jordan Love is absolutely the guy, and we're giving him that contract. But we've seen players put together that kind of sample size of really high-end play before and not been able to sustain it, not been able to repeat it the year, subsequently, and just not been that guy. And I think Baker Mayfield might be the best example of that. Like we have seen a half season, 2020, whatever it was, like that year, Baker Mayfield had basically the season that we saw from Jordan Love here. And if you had said, and we did, coming off that year, is Baker for real now? You'd say absolutely. Next year is going to be a star, blah, blah, blah. So it's entirely possible Jordan Love is legit, that he's for real, that everything we saw makes sense. It's also possible that it doesn't happen. Now, part of that with Baker Mayfield is he got injured and and things fell apart around him, and it's not necessarily entirely his fault. So if things don't unravel around Jordan Love, maybe he'll be protected from that, even if he isn't, going to be the superstar every single game, every single week. But it is still a risk that, like, hey, what if the second half of Jordan Love isn't who he's going to be the whole time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the worst case scenario. Obviously, is Love regresses, and again, the tale of two seasons. The first half of the season, accuracy was off, receivers weren't on the same page, a lot of inconsistency, late game opportunities to win games, throwing those away. And the second half just was like, oh yeah, there are elements of incredible athleticism and arm talent and natural playmaking in Jordan Love's game that he wasn't showing the first 6 or 7 weeks of the season.
So with football, there's always this debate when it comes to sample size about like how much, what is a pattern and what is just random distribution of variance, right? Because the Packers season looked like it sort of neatly fell into rough first half, great second half. It's a pattern. Your brain goes, well, that's young players. That's what they do. They start off a little rough, then they get better, and they keep getting better because they're young and they're getting experience and they're developing. It might, however, just be the distribution of random chance that is more inherent with young players who are more inconsistent. So the worst case scenario for Green Bay is that they're actually not any better than they were a year ago, and the games are just distributed more randomly, so that instead of a or a rough second half, a rough first half rather, and a great second half, it's just more random, and you get a good game and a bad game and a good game and a bad game, and it spits out at roughly the same level of sort of borderline playoff team who may or may not show up in the playoffs.
And the other piece of it is the league starts to adjust, right? You mentioned Baker Mayfield. Like, a lot of players have had 8 or 10 good games, even in a row. Trevor Lawrence did it too. The league will adjust back, and it's your job to adjust to the adjustments. That is all part of it. Key players for the Packers, or key unit. I struggled looking specifically. I think defensively, the linebacker unit needed to be addressed maybe this offseason. They did that with Edgerrin Cooper in the second round, Tyrone Hopper later. I don't know if those guys are going to play right away, but it feels like linebacker or just the front seven generally for the defense is going to be under the microscope this year for the Packers.
I think the wide receiver group is the key. Everyone's fascinated by, like, do they have a number one? Who is the number one? Do they even need a number one? I don't know that matters. I know Matt LaFleur is getting kind of testy. People keep asking him who the number one receiver is. Or
I saw that quote. He's very upset about that. Yeah.
Yeah. Says he wants to vomit anytime somebody brings up the term number one wide receiver. And that might be a little bit strong. But the more important point is, like, what is the level of this group going to be? Are they going to actually get better than a year ago? Or, like, Romeo Doubs, I think, is a classic example of, like, the entire receiving core right now might just be a collection of Romeo Doubs, which are these guys that show really well in preseason, are definitely useful NFL players, but may have a level that they don't go beyond and, like, may never become better than that. And he's just sort of, and if they just have 4 or 5 of these guys that are, like, okay, useful NFL players, but there's no consistent difference maker, is that good enough? Or, does Christian Watson now rebound now that he's got his hamstrings aligned and calibrated? Does Jaden Reed take a step forward in year 2? Does Dontavian Wicks actually become a legitimate number one? Like, is he the guy that's going to emerge in this receiving core? Just generally what this receiving core is going to become with all of these young players who were basically all in, like, their first 3 years in the league.
I think the number one discussion is valid if you have a receiving unit like the Patriots had last couple years, where the collection of guys, it's like nobody's actually that good. And if you had a number one receiver, everyone can do a little bit less, and that's good for the team. I think in Green Bay's, in their case, I don't think the number one thing matters, because I think they're all good, and they're all in their first 3 years in the league. Christian Watson as a deep threat, Jaden Reed as a shifty, change of pace, slot receiver type, Dontavian Wicks as a vertical threat, intermediate threat, Romeo Doubs as the high-end possession type. They have all the pieces they need. Luke Musgrave as a mismatched tight end. They have all the pieces they need. Will they be a key? Absolutely. Completely agree. And again, I'm interested to know where you're going to pick the Packers, because I think the range could be anywhere in this NFC North. Anything else on the Packers for you? They don't need a number one. They have plenty of pass-catching weapons.
Yeah, just because that how heavily invested in the youth movement they are, I think they have one of the broader range of outcomes of teams, in the NFL. They could go all the way from Super Bowl to, not really any better than a year ago, and maybe actually it takes a step backwards because of this just the inherent volatility of a bunch of young players.